Good morning. It is Friday, November 20th. I'm Jason Stanton. I serve at First Lutheran in Onalaska as senior pastor, and this is my morning musing for today. As I've been reading about vaccines, actually on one of the sites that I read my news, they have a vaccine tracker. And there's 37 vaccines that have been approved to do this, and this for trials. And then of the 37, here's how many have reached the next stage. And there's like 4 different stages. And of course, I know I hope a lot of us have heard about, there's at least 2 that have gotten to nearly the last stage, to be, almost going to be mass produced. And as we look at the timelines for how, if these vaccines turn out to work, and are safe, and can be mass produced, and all the other stuff that goes along with it. But it seems like a lot of people who know what they're talking about feel like by next summer. I mean, it's all guesses. Obviously, time has no meaning. We've learned that in the last 8 months, but it seems like we're about halfway. It feels like halftime to me as we try to figure out, how long have we been doing this since March? That's 8 months, almost 8 months to the day. And then how much longer might we have? It seems like middle of the summer-ish is when we're gonna start to feel like normal might be around. And at least it'll be summer when we can be outside more, where we know it is safer than being indoors with people breathing their mouth mist, as I've heard it called by some. Anyway, if we are about at halftime, if that's true, which it seems like that's an educated guess right now, I feel like it's time to take stock. I'm a football fan, and I know that that's kind of what halftime is for. You go into the locker room at halftime and you wonder, okay, so here's what happened, here's how they came at us. Now what are we going to do in the second half? How are we going to change things up? What adjustments do we need to make? And I feel like that's kind of where we're at as we look into Thanksgiving, as we look into Christmas and New Year's, and what I'm certain will feel like a very long winter. And yet there's this kind of light that we see at the end of a very long tunnel. And so as I think about what adjustments need to be made, I know for some of us, we come into halftime feeling completely exhausted. Like, this can't only be half of the way there. No, I need for this to be the end. I need to meet with my family immediately, and my friends and my church, and I need everything to be back to normal. And of course we all want it to be back to normal. That's not the question. It's how do we get to the end? And it reminds me, today in our Bible readers story, we're reading from 1 Samuel, the last 4 chapters. And I read a chapter from 1 Samuel that I had no memory of it at all. And it's chapter 28, 1 Samuel 28. And in my commentary, they called it the Ghost of Samuel. And I'm like, what is this? And basically Saul, and if you don't remember, Saul is the first king that God calls to serve Israel. And it just doesn't work out. Saul is king for a while, but he's just not, it turns out it's not going to work. And so God basically removes God's blessing from him in favor of David. Now, Saul has some choices at that point. Sorry about the siren. But Saul has some choices at that point. Saul could step away gracefully and say, it turns out I'm not the guy. David, here you go. Here's the keys to the car. But that's not how Saul treats it. Saul instead desperately flails around, unwilling to give up power. And instead of remaining faithful to what Saul knows to be faithful, Saul seeks out power and control wherever else he can. He tries to kill David. He tries to hold on to something that isn't his anymore. And eventually we get to chapter 28, and he tries to find a medium. I don't think it's a story meant to give credibility to Ouija boards, but I mean, it's not like anybody says, well, we can summon up the spirits. Just look at the Bible. Look at 1 Samuel chapter 28. Instead, I think it's a story about how do different people face the challenges of crisis. And for Saul, he faces the challenge of crisis by resorting to idolatry. He leaves the presence and power of God in favor of this other way. And of course, it's a way that leads to nowhere. It's a way that leads to, for him, defeat and death. It's an extreme example, obviously. But then we see soon thereafter what faithfulness can look like, and how David, in the midst of crisis, will not become violent, does not take what he thinks should be his, but instead lets kingship come in its time, in the way that God chooses. I say all this because if we are at halftime of a pandemic, it has been real crisis. This has been a genuine crisis for First Lutheran. We have experienced, this church has experienced these last 8 months as a crisis. We can't meet in person, and so it's a question of what shall we do. And I don't mean that it's just been a crisis for the pastors, the staff, and the leaders of our church. I mean you. First Lutheran isn't me. First Lutheran isn't our staff and leaders. First Lutheran doesn't exist except for the 1,800 plus people who learn, serve, and worship together in our family of faith. Like, we are together, First Lutheran. So what have we done in crisis? And that's when I think, have we kind of been Saul in the midst of this, just flailing around in desperation? Or have we leaned into the strength that God has given us and the path that God would have us walk? And when I think about how our learning, whether it be confirmation or Bible readers, it's not the same. Some of the ways that we learned certainly hasn't grown in numbers. When I think of Sunday school, that's been a challenge. I don't know of any churches that have really, thrived more than what they were doing before. But we are, it seems, trying to figure out how to learn anew and grow our learning. When I've got dozens of people reading the whole Bible, parts that are really boring, that's something. Worship has been a challenge. How do you worship well? And yet I hear from people, that this part and that part about worshiping online isn't so bad. Just keeping my sweatpants on, eating, drinking my coffee, not having to corral my kids or tell them to shh. We're figuring it out. And our service has continued. We have leaders among our church that are leading our community, advocating for safe gatherings. And the ways that our church has given, financially speaking, the generosity has amazed me. This Sunday, we're going to burn the mortgage. We're going to be debt-free as a congregation for the first time, I don't know, maybe ever. I really genuinely don't know when was the last time First Lutheran didn't have any debt. That means there's an opportunity to continue giving generously, but instead of having our generous giving going to a mortgage, we can start to really focus our generosity on being givers outside of ourselves, that we would support institutions beyond us. We're not flailing out of frustration. We're faithfully looking for ways to meet this moment generously. And for that, I say thank you so much. And I hope you are able to tune in at 8 o'clock or 10:30 as we live stream. We've got a special way of celebrating the burning of our mortgage. It does include a blowtorch, just so you know. See you then.